Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. A bombshell report dropping that suggests multiple teams in Formula 1 have been abusing various loopholes to take advantage of the way the regulations are presently written. Panic rumours say that it's Red Bull and Mercedes especially that are under the spotlight this weekend. Mercedes for some trickery on their rear wing, Red Bull for some similar trickery on their underfloor. One engineer suggests this will have a big impact potentially on performance and will change the balance of some of the cars. What does that mean for this weekend's Singapore Grand Prix? We're going to discuss all the potential implications today. Very much intrigued to your perspective in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This weekend is also Sergio Perez's, last year's winner here of course, 250th Grand Prix. No big updates yet on his future. Helmut Marko, after the very interesting comments he's made on Perez over the last few days, has now said, you know, the PR department told me I can't speak to you anymore about Perez because it's only going to end badly. So he says, yeah, if there are any questions, I won't answer them. I'll only talk about sporting matters. Also, again, commenting on Norris and implying there is interest there. But he says, look, he's got a contract until the end of 2025, so we can't get him yet. But that's never stopped these teams trying before. This, though, is the big talking point. TD018. Arriving this weekend for the Singapore Grand Prix to clarify the way the rules are intended to be written. Now, to see the full picture here, you have to cast your mind back to Spa 2022 when TD039, or Technical Directive 39, was coming into play. This increased the ride height of the car. Basically, it mandated that the cars had to be riding at a level where porpoising wasn't going to happen so much anymore. That didn't really affect teams massively just because at that point in the season, the teams had generally understood how to get porpoising under control. But it was the changes to the flexi floors that were most of interest. The rumour was that both Red Bull and Ferrari, the two dominant teams at the start of last season, were exploiting a loophole in the floor design. During the course of a Grand Prix, the floor plank is only allowed to wear by like a millimetre, and the teams were using, but it was only tested in like 2 locations, and therefore the teams were designing these planks in such a way that they could wear more in other places that weren't tested. So using some flexibility, which would give them extra performance. This was not intended by the FIA. They clamped down on it in TD39, introduced at Spa, and the question was, is this going to affect Ferrari and Red Bull significantly? Most people thought it wasn't going to do much, and it didn't affect Red Bull at all. They, if anything, got even better. But Ferrari, it did seem to affect them quite significantly. Ever since Spa 2022, Ferrari have really been absolutely nowhere. Now, was that because of TD39? You can argue that Red Bull's development and the ceiling of that car in terms of development potential was just way higher than Ferrari. Their development progress was better, and they would have dominated the second half of the season anyway. But it did feel like TD39 really killed Ferrari in some respect. At least it kind of looks that way when you look at the results before and after. So now we fast forward to the present day TD018, and the flexi floors are still a conversation here that TD018 will clamp down on in addition to the flexi wings. So we discussed this a couple of weeks ago now, this whole flexi wing cheating drama, certain teams abusing loopholes to allow the front wings especially, maybe the rear wings as well, to flex more under load than is intended by when they do the tests, the FIA, when they're standing still. Front wing, rear wing, just to gain extra performance. Something rather marginal, but of course, if you have to change your wing, then it changes the airflow, changes the balance, and could have other consequences. So AMUS and Michael Schmidt here come out with a big article yesterday discussing in detail what the rumours they've heard are with regard to this. Now, if Michael Schmidt says something for AMUS, there is very likely to be a very solid amount of truth behind what he has to say. So I'll discuss in a second some of the key points from the article, especially from what Organic Measurement here puts together on the Reddit. So this is also clamping down on TD39 because apparently teams have found ways which that floor plank doesn't wear out too much. So the floor plank was the big talking point of TD39 at Spa last year, but apparently teams have been using some insulating material between the chassis and the plank and then fastening screws into the plank to basically do what they were previously doing and not suffer from these issues. So the FIA is now like, all right, we're going to stop these tricks with this plank and make sure you have to run your ride height correctly because, you know, for example, in Spa, the Red Bull, if you watch that Grand Prix, you will know the Red Bull was sparking up Eau Rouge and Raidillon every single lap, more than all the other cars. They were able to run their car much lower to the ground. And other teams have asked the question, like, how are they able to do that and not suffer with the plank wearing out more than it's allowed to? And maybe this is one of the reasons why. So now, in addition to TD018, they're introducing some modifications to TD039 to address these grey areas. Now, the main point of this new one, TD018, just to say it again, is to clamp down on the flexy front and rear wings. The rumour is that AMR, like Aston Martin, were using this a long time ago, and I think they've been told a long time ago now they had to change their front wing, and I think they did it several races back. Now, maybe there's still more to come on that. It's difficult to say whether Aston Martin have already taken the hit from this TD or whether there's going to be further changes. Total Wolf said they already had to take a step back, so it's interesting to see what happens next. Most teams seem to believe they're in the clear from this, at least that's what they say, but as Michael Schmidt says, in reality, a lot of teams used these new FIA measurements in Monza to check whether they are going to fall in line. Now, the final part is said in more detail right here, so we'll look at it verbatim, at least the English translation. So, firstly, these are the teams. Haas reported that the rear wing needs to be slightly changed. Maybe it's slightly too flexible for the new rules. At Williams, there's focus on the underbody. But the key two teams, of course, that are of note here are Red Bull and Mercedes. Rumours in the paddock say that Mercedes are going to be affected by the rear wing and Red Bull by the underbody, i.e. the floor of the car, which is very interesting given where people believe Red Bull's advantage might be coming from. It's everywhere, really, including suspension, but part of it is certainly the floor. Now, firstly, on the Mercedes rear wing discussion, because if there's any part of the Mercedes which is a weakness, people say straight line speed, which is true to some extent, but the main weakness is rear instability. If you watch any of the Mercedes onboards, I remember, like, even in Zandvoort, where the Mercedes was quite good, watching Hamilton or Russell try and get round a corner is like, it's incredibly difficult. The rear of the car is constantly stepping out. So many corrections need to be made. Same if you watch Hamilton's pole lap around Budapest. Like, the car was not particularly compliant, especially compared to when you watch a Red Bull on board of either Perez or Verstappen. So the rear instability is an issue for Mercedes. And if now their rear wing is not compliant and they have to change it, maybe they can even find a way to make it better, but, you know, likely it's going to get worse, and therefore that problem gets worse, which is definitely a concern for them, but difficult to say because, you know, it's tough to imagine the rear instability of the Merc can get much worse than what it presently is because the other parts of the car are pretty strong. It's got a good front end on it. Now, the Red Bull, this is where people are really interested about exactly what's happening here and whether it's going to affect the Red Bull's floor, because as it was then said slightly later in the article by an engineer, this doesn't just affect, it's not just losing you a tenth by changing up the floor and everything. If you have to run that car at a different ride height now, or you have to make some changes to the underfloor for whatever reason, likely it might be to do with potential wearing of the plank due to TD39 not getting implemented properly. Loopholes were found. You know, it's Adrian Newey, it's Red Bull, it's Formula 1. Everyone's finding loopholes. That's the name of the game. But an engineer estimates the effect of this wing TD, this new one, to be greater than the restrictions on the underbody that we saw last year. So, I mean, look, it didn't seem like last year's TD39 did that much, but it did seem to kill Ferrari, although it might not have done. There's a debate on that. But this engineer says the impact of this is going to be greater than the impact of the one at Spa last year. If you have to make corrections to the underbody, which we believe is the case with Red Bull, at least based on paddock rumours, and as a result leave a little more ground clearance, in the worst case scenario, you lose downforce. If the front wing is twisted around the attachment point on the nose, the entire aero was designed accordingly to that. If you have to take a step back, you not only risk a loss of downforce, but also problems with the balance. So, what's going to happen here? Do we know? No, of course we don't. Now, Giuliano De Chessa and Formula Uno have put out their own article saying that their paddock rumours believe that it's going to be Red Bull, Mercedes, and potentially McLaren affected by this to a lesser extent, and engineers will struggle with the migration of the balance of the car. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here. If Red Bull do have to make changes to the underfloor, if Mercedes do have to make changes to the rear wing, that is going to make it a struggle to get their car in the right window and might even straight up cost them big performance. Now, Toto Wolff said it would be really nice if Red Bull lost half a second because of this. That seems massively unlikely, and even if the Red Bull is affected somewhat, it's not going to be enough, I don't think, to stop them being the fastest car, but it might make the performance delta close enough so that they're actually beatable. That's a possibility. I think for those of us who want to see someone else win from now to the end of the season, that's probably the best case scenario, is that more teams become competitive with Red Bull. Now, Ferrari, apparently they're going to be okay. They are unlikely. The rumor is that given Ferrari's relatively poor pace, they're unlikely to be benefiting from any of these tricks. So, you know, hopefully Ferrari aren't using any of the tricks, because if they are and have been pretty bad the last few races apart from Monza, it wouldn't really be a good sign. But Mercedes and Red Bull especially might take a step back here. Now, Pierre Vacher from Red Bull actually commented on the front wings and says that, well, you know, teams like Aston Martin and Mercedes are playing with the deviation, but that's maybe gaining them 1/10 of a second. But, you know, that's not the entire picture here, because as we said, if teams such as Red Bull have been exploiting some loophole to get around TD39, and now that's being clamped down on until they find another loophole, right? And maybe teams will, over time, to get around it again, this might affect them more than Red Bull are currently letting on. What does that mean for the pecking order? Because the last couple of days I've talked about what's the most likely team to actually beat Red Bull in a race. I still think it's likely to be Mercedes, but, you know, who knows? Could be Ferrari, could be Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin. I also need to mention McLaren. I know that we did say a second ago that maybe they'll get affected by this as well, which is possible, but McLaren could be pretty good around Singapore. They were good in Hungary, so maybe there's a chance there that Norris or Piastri could get, you know, the first victory of the season that isn't a Red Bull victory, however unlikely that presently seems. And even Lando Norris has just said recently that this is the closest they've ever been to a race win, which is, you know, questionable at the very least, because they did win in 2021 at Monza, and he probably should have won at Sochi that year as well. But yeah, at least since the regulation changes, this is the best McLaren have looked, and apparently he's very confident they can get the job done at some point. Maybe a circuit like Singapore is going to give them a chance, especially if a lot of the leaders of laps so far this season, Verstappen, Perez, Hamilton, Russell, could be affected by these changes. Might open the door for Ferrari as well. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens this weekend, or whether there's anything that changes at all, and everything is simply business as usual, and Red Bull and Max Verstappen are winning by 30 or so seconds. We shall see, but very much intrigued to your perspective in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.